She said it like it was nothing, like it was just a fact of life, something everyone at that table already knew and had simply been too polite to say out loud. We were at Marcus and Dana's house, 8 people around a dinner table, good wine, decent food, the kind of evening where everyone is performing a slightly better version of themselves. I'd made a comment, something small, something about a work opportunity I'd been thinking about, a lateral move, different company, different city, more money. I wasn't even asking for her opinion. I was just talking, the way people talk at dinner. She laughed first. Not a warm laugh, the kind that signals to everyone else in the room that they're about to watch something uncomfortable. Then she said it. Honestly, babe, let's be real. Who else is gonna hire you? And honestly, who else is gonna want you? She picked up her wine glass right after, took a sip, smiled at Dana across the table like she'd just said something clever. The table went quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet, the kind where everyone is suddenly very focused on their food, their napkins, the middle distance, anything to avoid making eye contact with the person who just got gutted in front of them. Marcus cleared his throat. Someone refilled their water glass. Dana said something about the pasta, and the moment was covered over, the way people cover things at dinner parties, quickly, carefully, without acknowledgement. I didn't respond, not because I had nothing to say, I had plenty, but I looked at her, sitting there, still half smiling, and I understood something in that moment that I hadn't let myself understand before. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't going to look over at me with a flash of regret and mouth, sorry. She wasn't going to steer the conversation somewhere else to give me room to recover. She was comfortable. She thought it was funny. She thought it landed well. That's the part that stayed with me. Not the words themselves. I'd heard variations of them before, in smaller doses, in private, in the particular tone she used when she wanted to remind me of something. But here, in front of people who knew us, people whose opinions we both cared about, she hadn't hesitated for a second, and nobody said anything. I sat with a neutral expression on my face for the rest of that dinner. I laughed when it was appropriate, I answered questions, I helped clear the plates at the end of the night. On the drive home, she talked the whole way. The food, the story about Dana's sister, something she wanted to do with the backyard. I listened, I said the right things, but something had closed. Not in the dramatic way people describe these moments, not a door slamming, not a flood of rage, more like a quiet click, the kind of sound a lock makes when it finally catches. I knew on that drive home that the version of me who was going to keep absorbing this had reached his limit. I just didn't tell her that. We met when I was 29. She was sharp, funny, the kind of person who owned every room she walked into without seeming to try. I was drawn to that. I'd spent most of my 20s being the quiet one, steady, reliable, not the person anyone wrote stories about. She made me feel like I was standing closer to the center of something. We dated for 2 years before we got married. Those 2 years were good. I want to be honest about that because it matters. This wasn't a relationship that was broken from the start. There were real things between us, real warmth, real partnership, at least for a while. The first year of marriage felt like an extension of that. Then, gradually, it didn't. I can't point to a single moment when the shift started. That's the thing about this kind of change. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Small things that you file away under bad day or stress or we're both tired. You give the benefit of the doubt because that's what you're supposed to do, because you love someone, because the alternative, admitting that a pattern exists, feels too large to look at directly. The first thing I noticed was the way she talked about me to other people. Not cruel, not obviously cutting, but there was always a slight downward angle to it, a qualifier. He's trying to get a promotion, bless him. He means well, he just doesn't always read the room. Little remarks that positioned me as someone who needed managing, someone whose efforts were charming but slightly misguided. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I told myself I was being sensitive. The second thing was the way she responded when I succeeded.
A promotion I'd worked 2 years for got a one-sentence acknowledgement and a subject change. A project I was genuinely proud of was met with a practical question about the extra hours it would require. There was no cruelty in it, just a consistent absence of real enthusiasm. And over time, that absence started to shape how I saw myself. I stopped bringing things home to share. I stopped expecting to be met with anything that felt like pride. That's the slow part, the part nobody talks about. It's not the sharp moments that do the most damage. It's the cumulative weight of being someone's afterthought in your own home, of learning to shrink the parts of yourself that don't get reflected back with any warmth. You don't notice it happening because you're inside it. You adjust in small increments until one day you look at how much space you've stopped taking up and you don't fully recognize the math. By year 3, I had quietly reorganized my self-image around her assessments. Not consciously, but the evidence was there. I second-guessed professional decisions I would have made without hesitation before.
I downplayed achievements in social settings before she could do it for me. I had developed a reflex. Get smaller before she makes you smaller. It felt like self-protection. It was actually just her voice living rent-free in my head. I want to be clear. I was not a passive victim in all of this. I made choices. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken. I rationalized when I should have named what I was seeing. I extended grace that was never asked for and never returned. But I also know now that the architecture of what she built was designed to make me doubt my own perception. And it worked. For a long time, it worked. 9:31 a.m. The dinner party wasn't an isolated moment. I know that now with complete clarity. But even before that night, some part of me had been quietly collecting evidence, storing instances in a part of my mind I didn't visit too often because I knew what I'd find there. Let me tell you what the pattern actually looked like. It wasn't constant. That's important to understand. If it had been constant, it would have been easier to name. Instead, it operated on a cycle. Weeks of normal, warm even, connected, the version of us that reminded me why I married her. And then, without obvious trigger, a shift, a coldness, a comment, a moment where she would say something that landed just wrong enough to leave a mark, and then move on as if nothing had happened. The irregularity was the mechanism. You can't build a case against weather. The comments themselves followed a specific architecture. They were always framed as honesty, as her just being real with me, saying the things other people were too nice to say. She positioned herself as the person who cared enough to tell me the truth, and because I respected directness, because I'd always valued honesty in a partner, that framing worked on me longer than it should have. I'm not trying to be mean, I just think you need to hear this. That sentence or a version of it preceded more damage than I can cleanly account for. There was the conversation after my brother's wedding where she told me I'd embarrassed her by dancing. Not that I'd done anything inappropriate, just that the way I carried myself was difficult to watch. I laughed it off. Privately, I felt it for weeks. There was the evening I cooked a dinner I'd spent real time on and she ate half of it, mentioned it was a bit dry, and spent the rest of the night on her phone. A small thing, I cataloged it anyway. There was the phone call I overheard, she didn't know I was home, where she described me to her friend as comfortable. Not in an affectionate way, in the way you describe a couch you haven't gotten around to replacing. Each incident on its own was deniable. Taken together, they formed something undeniable. What I was only beginning to understand was that the public moments, the ones in front of others, served a different function than the private ones. The private comments eroded my self-perception, but the public ones were about something else. They were about establishing, in front of witnesses, a particular version of who I was. Manageable, limited, lucky to have her. It was a positioning strategy. I don't think it was entirely conscious, but intent doesn't change impact. The dinner party comment, "Who else is going to want you?" wasn't a slip. It was the pattern reaching its most confident expression. She said it in public because somewhere along the way she had decided it was simply true and that everyone present would recognize it as true and that I would sit there and confirm it with my silence. She had spent years making that silence feel inevitable.
What she hadn't accounted for was the moment when I started listening to it differently. Silence can mean acceptance. It can also mean calculation. She assumed it was the first one. I want to walk you through that evening properly, not the headline version.
The full scene. Because the details matter. They're what separates a moment that passes from a moment that changes the entire direction of something. We arrived at Marcus and Dana's around 7. It was a Saturday, the kind of early autumn evening where it's still warm enough to have the back doors open, but you can feel the season starting to turn. There were 4 other couples, people we'd known for varying lengths of time, the kind of friends who exist in the overlap between her social world and mine. Not people I'd chosen independently, but people I'd genuinely come to like. Dinner was casual. The conversation moved the way it does in those settings. Work, travel, something in the news, a renovation someone was doing. I was relaxed. I remember that specifically because I've gone back over it many times since, and I want to be accurate. I wasn't in a fragile state that night. I wasn't primed for conflict. I was just at dinner with people I knew. The work opportunity came up organically. Someone asked what was new, and I mentioned I'd been approached about a role. Different company, different city, a meaningful step up in both responsibility and compensation. I wasn't asking for feedback, I was just sharing the way people share things at dinner. She was sitting directly across from me. I saw something move across her face before she spoke. Not quite irritation, something more controlled than that. A decision being made. Then, the laugh. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It was calibrated, just big enough to signal to the table that what was coming was meant to be taken lightly, which is exactly the kind of framing that makes what follows land harder. Honestly, babe, let's be real. She paused just long enough for the table to orient toward her. Who else is going to hire you? And honestly, who else is going to want you? Wine glass, sip, small smile at Dana. The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds.
In a dinner party, 4 seconds is a very long time. I watched it move around the table. James, on my left, looked down at his plate. His wife reached for the bread without making eye contact with anyone. Dana's expression did something complicated. A flash of discomfort she smoothed over almost immediately. Marcus looked at me directly for just a moment, and what I saw in his face was something close to pity, which was almost worse than the comment itself. Then Dana said something about the pasta, Marcus picked it up, the conversation restarted. I said something, I don't remember what, something that functioned as a normal response and allowed the moment to be covered over. My voice came out even, my face stayed neutral. Inside, something was happening that I didn't have language for yet. It wasn't rage, it wasn't humiliation exactly, though humiliation was part of it. It was more like the sudden removal of a last remaining uncertainty. I had spent a long time giving her the benefit of the doubt, telling myself the pattern wasn't a pattern, that the comments came from stress, from her own insecurity, from dynamics I didn't fully understand. In 4 seconds, across a dinner table with 7 witnesses, that work was undone. Not because the words were the worst thing she'd ever said to me, but because of how comfortable she was saying them. She didn't waver, she didn't lower her voice, she didn't check my face afterward to see how I'd received it. She already knew I'd absorb it. She had built a version of me that she was completely confident would sit there and take it. And she was right. I did sit there. I did take it. But she had miscalculated what that silence meant. 9:33 a.m. I woke up the next morning before she did. I lay there for a while in the early quiet, staring at the ceiling, running through the previous night with the kind of clarity that only comes when the social performance is over and you're alone with what actually happened.
I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I had expected to wake up with the hot, unsettled feeling that usually followed her worst moments. Instead, there was something cooler in its place. More still. Like the difference between turbulent water and deep water. She woke up around 8:30. I watched her move through the morning. Coffee, phone, a comment about the weather. She was relaxed. Easy. She mentioned something Marcus had said at dinner that she found funny and laughed about it while she waited for the toast. No acknowledgement.
Not a sideways glance to check where we stood. Not a careful tone that signaled awareness of a line crossed. Nothing that indicated the previous evening had registered as anything other than a pleasant Saturday night with friends. I handed her the coffee without saying much. She didn't notice the quiet. That's when it fully landed. Not the comment itself. I'd been processing that since the drive home. What landed now was this. She wasn't avoiding the subject. She wasn't managing her behavior around it. She genuinely did not experience what happened as something that required acknowledgement or repair. In her version of events, nothing had gone wrong. I've thought about this a lot since. There are different categories of people who say damaging things. Some say them in anger and regret it after. Some say them carelessly and feel embarrassed when it's pointed out. And then there are people who say them with intention, from a place of settled belief, and experience no friction afterward because the comment aligned perfectly with how they already saw the world. She was the third kind, and understanding that changed the entire shape of the problem. If she'd apologized, I might have re-entered the familiar cycle, the repair, the brief warmth, the gradual return to baseline. That cycle had carried us a long way. I knew its rhythms. I knew how to move through it. But there was new cycle to enter this time.
There was just her at the kitchen counter, reading something on her phone, completely unbothered. I thought about saying something, naming it directly. What you said last night in front of everyone was not acceptable. I ran the conversation in my head. I knew how it would go. She would reframe it as a joke, then as honesty. Then, if I pushed further, she would make the conversation about my sensitivity, my inability to take feedback, the way I always made things harder than they needed to be. I had been through enough versions of that conversation to know exactly where it ended. It ended with me managing her reaction to being confronted about her behavior. I wasn't willing to do that anymore, so I didn't say anything that morning. I finished my coffee. I said I was going for a walk. She said okay without looking up. I walked for about an hour. No destination, no podcast, no distraction. Just the morning and my own thinking. By the time I got back, something had resolved in me that I hadn't consciously decided. The absence of her apology hadn't just confirmed the pattern. It had closed the last door I'd been keeping open, the one that required believing she might eventually see what she was doing. She didn't see it. She would never see it. And that meant this wasn't a problem that could be fixed from inside the marriage. 9:33 a.m. I didn't make any sudden moves. That was a conscious choice. Everything I did in the weeks that followed was deliberate, measured, and quiet. Not because I was afraid of her reaction. I'd stopped organizing my behavior around her reactions somewhere between the dinner party and that morning walk. But because I understood that the way I moved now would determine what I was able to protect later. The first thing I did was call a lawyer, not a friend of a friend recommendation. I researched, asked careful questions through a work contact I trusted, and booked a consultation with a family law attorney who had a specific reputation for handling high-conflict dissolutions cleanly. I went on a Tuesday afternoon. I told her I had a work appointment. The consultation lasted an hour. I walked in thinking I was gathering information. I walked out understanding that I had already made the decision and was now in the logistics phase. There's a difference between considering divorce and preparing for it. That Tuesday was the line between the two. The attorney was direct. She laid out what the process would look like, what documentation would be useful, what I should and shouldn't do in the period before filing. She asked about assets, about the length of the marriage, about whether there were children. No children. That simplified things in practical terms, though it didn't make anything easier in the ways that actually hurt. She told me to keep records, not in a paranoid way, just accurate, time-stamped documentation of anything financially relevant, any communication that established patterns, any incidents that might become relevant if the process became adversarial. She said most people wait too long to start and spend the back half of the process trying to reconstruct things from memory. I started that night. I went through emails, I noted financial accounts and their current states. I began keeping a simple document, dates, incidents, direct quotes where I could remember them accurately. Not to build a weapon, to build a record. There's a difference. I also began quietly separating certain things, not in ways that would be visible or that crossed any legal lines. My attorney had been clear about what was and wasn't appropriate, but I started to understand the full shape of our financial life together in a way I hadn't prioritized before. I had trusted her with more of that than I should have.
That trust had been, in retrospect, another expression of the same dynamic. Me making myself smaller, less informed, easier to manage. I paid attention now. At home, I was the same, steady, present, functional. I didn't withdraw in obvious ways. I didn't start arguments. I didn't give her information about what I was thinking or planning. This wasn't cruelty, it was protection, for both of us in different ways. A sudden confrontation without preparation helps no one. She noticed nothing for the first 2 weeks. In the third week, she asked me once if I was okay. I said I was fine, just tired from work. She accepted that without follow-up, which told me something about how much she was actually paying attention versus how much she assumed she already knew. By the end of week 4, I had everything I needed to move forward. I called my attorney on a Friday morning and told her I was ready to proceed. She said she'd have the papers prepared within 10 days. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat for a moment in my car in the parking garage before going back into the office. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't grieving yet either. I was just very clear. That clarity, after years of the opposite, felt like something I hadn't known I was missing. She noticed something was different before she could name what it was. That's the thing about withdrawal when it's controlled. It doesn't announce itself. There's no single behavior to point to, no obvious coldness, no slammed doors. Just a slight but consistent reduction in availability, less engagement, shorter responses, a general sense of a person who is present but no longer invested. She felt it, she just didn't understand it. The first sign was that she became more attentive. Small things. She cooked dinner twice in 1 week without being asked, which was unusual. She referenced an inside joke from early in our relationship, the kind of callback people use when they're trying to reestablish warmth.
She suggested we watch something together on a Thursday night and sat closer than she normally would have. I didn't reject any of it. I participated. I was warm enough to avoid triggering alarm, but not so warm that I was sending false signals. I was threading a specific needle, and I knew it. What I was watching for was whether the attention came with any awareness, any sign that she understood something had shifted because of her behavior and not just my mood. Whether she would say anything that indicated she knew what the dinner party comment had cost. She didn't. The affection was real, but it was reflexive. It was the behavior of someone who sensed distance and wanted to close it, not someone who understood why the distance existed. There was no accountability underneath it, just the instinct to pull me back. When the warmth didn't produce the response she expected, the strategy shifted. That's when the guilt arrived. It started subtly, comments about how hard she'd been working, how stressed she was, how much she needed support right now. Not accusations exactly, but a framing that positioned my emotional withdrawal as something I was doing to her during a difficult time. She wasn't naming the withdrawal directly, she was just constructing a context in which my distance was unkind. I recognized this. It was a version of something she'd done before, a way of reorienting the emotional dynamic so that her needs became the center of any tension between us. It was effective historically because I was someone who responded to perceived guilt, who would soften when I thought I was causing someone pain. I didn't soften this time. I acknowledged what she said. I told her I heard her. I asked a few genuine questions about what was stressing her out. I was not unkind, but I didn't move. The warmth I offered was measured, and it didn't cross back into the territory she was trying to recover. She tried once more, about a week before the papers were due. We were in the kitchen after dinner, and she said, out of nowhere, that she felt like she didn't know where my head was lately.
that I seemed far away, that she missed me. I looked at her for a moment. She looked genuine, soft in a way she didn't often allow herself to be. And I want to be honest, there was something in that moment that was hard. Not hard enough to change anything, but hard in the way that real endings are hard, when you can see the person underneath the patterns and remember what it felt like before the patterns took over. I told her things had just been heavy lately, work stuff, that I'd been in my head. She accepted it, reached over and squeezed my hand. 4 days later, the papers arrived. The process server came on a Wednesday morning. She was home, I had made sure of that, not to be cruel, but because the alternative was having the papers arrive while she was at work, which would have meant hours of waiting and a confrontation on her timeline rather than a neutral one. I had thought about the logistics carefully. That was the mode I was operating in by then. Logistics, clarity, one step at a time. I was not home when it happened. My attorney had advised that being present for the serving was rarely productive and occasionally made things significantly worse. So, I was at work. I had told my assistant to hold my calls for the morning, and I sat at my desk and did what I could to focus on the work in front of me. My phone lit up at 9:47. 12 missed calls by noon. The first voicemail was confusion, genuine, unguarded confusion, the sound of someone who has just been handed something that doesn't compute. She said my name 3 times, asked what this was, said there must be a mistake. The second was anger. By the third, her voice had changed into something I hadn't heard before. Not the controlled edge she used when she wanted to win an argument. Something rawer than that. Something that sounded, underneath the rage, a lot like fear.
I didn't call back that day. Not because I wanted to punish her with silence, I want to be clear about that, but because my attorney had been specific. The period immediately following service is the most volatile, and engaging in that window rarely leads to productive conversation. It leads to statements made in heat that complicate the process. I was protecting the integrity of what I had set in motion. I went home that evening because it was my home and I wasn't going to be displaced from it. She was sitting in the living room when I walked in. The papers were on the coffee table. She had clearly been crying, though she had tried to compose herself before I arrived. Her eyes were red. Her posture was controlled in the way people hold themselves when they're trying not to fall apart in front of someone. She asked me why. I told her she already knew why. She said she didn't, said she had no idea where this was coming from, said we had issues like every couple, but nothing that warranted this, nothing that couldn't be worked through. I sat down. I stayed calm. I told her about the dinner party. Not as the sole reason, I told her it was the clearest moment in a pattern that had been building for years. I named some of the others, quietly, specifically, without raising my voice. She went through several responses in quick succession. It was a joke. I was too sensitive. She had been stressed. She loved me. She could change. And then, the one I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. No one else is going to put up with you either, you know. She said it in desperation, a reflex, the same move one more time because it was the only card she knew how to play. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, quietly, that I appreciated her making this easier. I didn't say it to wound her. I said it because it was true. 9:36 a.m. The weeks after that conversation were their own kind of difficult. Not dramatic in the way people imagine divorce fallout to be.
No public scenes, no screaming in driveways, just the slow, unglamorous process of 2 lives that had been joined for years beginning to separate, practically, socially, emotionally. The mutual friends were the hardest part. We had built a shared social world over the course of the marriage, and that world now had to contend with what had happened. I wasn't under any illusion that this would be clean. When a marriage ends, people who care about both people are put in an uncomfortable position. Most of them handle it badly through no fault of their own. They simply don't have good tools for it. Some people drifted toward her. That was expected. She had known several of them longer, and I suspected she was telling a version of events that positioned her sympathetically, the abandoned wife, blindsided, no warning given. I had no interest in countering that narrative publicly. I said very little to anyone about the specifics. What I noticed, though, was that some people already knew. Not the details, but the texture. Marcus pulled me aside about 3 weeks after the papers were served. We met for coffee. He didn't ask me to explain myself or defend my decision. He just said he was sorry it had gotten to that point, and that he wanted me to know he'd seen things over the years that made sense of it. He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask him to. But that conversation meant something. It confirmed what I had suspected, that the dinner party moment hadn't read the way she intended to everyone at that table, that her confidence in her own performance had been misplaced. People had noticed. They'd simply done what people do in social settings and covered it over. Dana was more complicated. She remained warm to me, but stayed closer to her. I respected that. They had a longer history, and I wasn't going to make anyone feel like they had to choose sides in a binary way. The ones who mattered would find their way to an honest position over time.
Her narrative began to fray at the edges within the first month, not because I said anything, but because the people who had been in that room and the people who had known us as a couple over the years had their own observations. When her version of events didn't fully match what they remembered, the gaps showed. I didn't need to fill them in. The gaps spoke for themselves. What I found hardest wasn't the social fallout. It was the quiet moments in the apartment after she had collected her things, the specific silence of a space that used to hold 2 people's routines and now only held 1. The coffee cups, the changed weight of the mornings. Grief doesn't require that something was good at the end. It just requires that it was real at some point. It had been real. That was worth grieving, separate from everything else. I let myself do that without turning it into a reason to question the decision. The sadness and the clarity existed at the same time. I didn't need to resolve that contradiction. I just needed to move through it. I've had a lot of time to think about what this cost. Not in a bitter way, in an honest one, because I think the cost is important to name. More important, actually, than any satisfaction that came from the reversal. The papers arriving, her reaction, the moment she repeated herself in desperation, none of that felt like winning. It felt like the final confirmation of something I had spent years hoping wouldn't be true. That's the actual price of this kind of ending. It's not paid at the dramatic moments. It's paid in the years before them. The slow accumulation of small surrenders, the gradual revision of your own self-image to fit someone else's assessment of you. The energy spent managing a dynamic that was never going to balance itself. By the time the papers arrived, I had already paid most of what this cost. The ending was just the receipt. Here's what I know now that I didn't know clearly enough then. Silence is not the same as acceptance. I stayed quiet across a lot of moments where I should have spoken, not to win arguments, but to establish that I had a position, that I saw what was happening, that I wasn't going to quietly confirm every diminishing thing she said about me by letting it sit unchallenged. My silence wasn't dignity. It was avoidance dressed up as restraint. There's a version of this story where I name the pattern 2 years earlier and something changes. I don't know if it would have, but I never gave it the chance. The second thing is about self-worth as infrastructure. What she built over those years only worked because I let her assessments become load-bearing. I outsourced my self-perception to someone who had a vested interest in keeping it low. That's not entirely her fault. I handed her that power incrementally, each time I absorbed a comment without examining why it landed so hard. Each time I adjusted my behavior to avoid triggering her, rather than asking whether her reactions were reasonable. You cannot build a stable life on someone else's opinion of you. That sounds simple. It wasn't simple to live. The third thing, and this is the one I come back to most, is about what the quiet decision-making in those final weeks taught me about myself. When I stopped reacting and started moving deliberately, something returned that I hadn't realized I'd lost. A sense of my own agency.
The understanding that I was capable of clear thinking and controlled action even inside emotional difficulty. She told me no one else would want me. I let her believe it while I built the exit, not as revenge, as information. Because what she revealed in saying it again on the night the papers arrived was that the belief was never really about me. It was about what she needed me to believe about myself in order to stay manageable. The moment that stopped working, the moment I stopped confirming it with my behavior, the architecture collapsed.
I'm not going to tell you life after looked like relief. It looked like work. Rebuilding routines, rebuilding a social world, rebuilding the internal voice that had been slowly replaced by hers over years of marriage. That process was slower and less satisfying than I expected. There was no morning where I woke up and felt straightforwardly free. But there were mornings where I made a decision, small or large, and felt it land as mine, where I took up space without preemptively shrinking, where I said something at a dinner table and didn't immediately monitor the room for her reaction. Those mornings accumulated, and slowly, without drama, without a clean, redemptive moment, I became someone who recognized himself again. That's what it cost. That's what it built. That's the whole story.